Hey everybody, welcome to the Find and Follow podcast, a podcast all about following Jesus in your day-to-day life. My name's Addison Roberts. I'm the digital pastor here at Grace Community Church of Willow Street, and today we sat down with Shelby Nauman. Now, Shelby is the CEO of Tenfold, which is an organization that works in housing for people who need housing. And this conversation was great. I learned a lot about housing and about homelessness in our community. So I'm excited for you to listen to it. So without further ado, here's Shelby. Shelby Nauman, thanks so much for popping in. Talk a little bit about who you are, what you do, and you guys have a project you're working on. You can, talk about that just, I think, either just opened or is opening really soon. But
great. Thanks so much for having me. So Shelby Nauman, I worship here at 9:15 most Sundays with my family. I'm CEO of Tenfold. And Tenfold strives to eliminate housing insecurity. So we have a range of programs that go from outreach workers who connect with people in the community that are experiencing homelessness, all the way up to lending. So people that want to purchase their first home, people that need help, with budget counseling. We do fair housing. We also have supportive housing, which is housing in the community where people need case management to maintain stable housing, and we do that throughout the community. So a range of things. We also have the TLC shelter at 105 East King Street, which is a transitional shelter for folks who are experiencing short-term homelessness to help them get back on their feet and then move out to sustainable housing.
yeah, so you guys opened that this year. And so talk a little bit about maybe somebody, lives in Lancaster. They go to our church, which means they're probably in LS, Penn Manor, CB school districts. Talk a little bit about kind of the challenge that is housing in Lancaster County. I told you before we recorded, I went through kind of a homelessness journey with an individual, and I was surprised at how hard it is to find somewhere for someone. I know it sounds, find somewhere for someone to sleep, but it's a challenge.
Mm-hmm. I can unpack it two ways. So the TLC shelter has actually been around since 1987. And so that shelter started because there were people that were being released from a lot of the state hospitals. There was that was happening in the late 80s, and those folks needed a lot more support to stay housed. So that was sort of the evolution of starting TLC. And then that continues today. That's a referral-based program. And then we have a low barrier shelter that we just opened November 4th this past year. And that is to bridge until a more permanent low barrier shelter opens in Otterbein Church on Clay Street, which we're calling the Clay Street Shelter. So we have 57 beds. The Clay Street Shelter will have 80 beds, and that's a more permanent solution.
When you say low barrier, define that term for me.
Sure. So no referral needed. People can come if they need a place to stay that night without a referral process. It can also mean that there are people who are experiencing addiction or mental health issues. We sort of evaluate them during the very immediate intake process to make sure that they can safely participate in shelter that evening. Our biggest priority is making sure we can provide a safe, warm, legal place for as many people as possible, in our case 57, to lay their heads at night. So we have to make sure that when we're evaluating folks during intake that they're able, to kind of help or maintain a calm environment. And that's the only reason we wouldn't allow them in.
So talk about in Lancaster, how much does demand outpace supply, not just maybe in housing, but just in kind of the specific world? Because I think before I went through this journey with the individual I'm talking about, I kind of thought like, well, sure, I could find somewhere for this guy to sleep. Like, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. I think I thought like, yeah, I would spend 8 hours on the phone. I'm sure I could find something. That wasn't the case. So talk a little bit about that reality.
Yeah. Water Street is a great partner of ours. Jack Crowley is a personal friend. I have such respect for the team at Water Street, but they've been maxed out, both in terms of actual space, at times because they haven't had enough staff. After COVID, it became really hard to maintain their staffing levels. And then in general, there's an annual event that happens in February of each year called the Point in Time Count, where people fan out across the county. They're looking in wooded areas, parks, laundromats, places like that, and trying to identify how many people are HUD-defined homeless, meaning they are living in their car or a structure not meant for human habitation or just outdoors.
Like a storage unit.
Correct. Yeah. Or tents or whatever. And this past year, we saw a 13.5% increase in that count. We were up around 597 people. So that's not necessarily people that are all outdoors. That could be people that are in shelters that, provide that service. But overall, we identified over almost 600 people that don't have permanent housing.
And that does or doesn't include people who are living month to month and,
does not include
hotel.
them. Yeah, we didn't do hotels.
Oh, geez.
But there's a large population of folks that are paying week to week to stay in hotels. We also know that there are a lot more people doubled up as a result of this housing crisis. And anecdotally, we know that because of people who were regularly visiting food banks and now how much more food they're requesting, which signals that there are more people in those households that were already struggling.
Yeah, there's an interesting thing at play here, and I want to navigate this. Like, there's probably an underreporting relative to the potential to lose your children, right? Like if you're in a situation like where if you're a family that's sleeping in a car, God forbid, right? You don't want that out there because like you will, end up dealing with what feels like an additional stressor in the foster system. Right. So yeah, you're dealing with a level of underreportedness, but the number you said was 587, the last point in time.
I think it was 597, February of 2024.
Yeah. So when we talk about a housing crisis, that's kind of like a buzzword, if you will, and maybe putting you on the spot. But when you define that in real terms, how does that play out at, in leading to an actual person becoming homeless?
Yeah, I think there's a couple factors. So one, I'll point to a study that was recently done by the Economic Development Company of Lancaster, where they looked at people's incomes, the household sizes, to really try to get a handle on how could we kind of right size, how to provide housing for as many people as possible that are already here. Two sort of things that came out of that. First, across the country, we are in the top 5%, not in a good way, in a bad way for lack of vacancy. So we have a vacancy rate that's under 2%.
Wow.
So we have almost no available units
and that's rentals.
That includes rentals, homes for sale. There's just very little vacant inventory. So what that does is people are paying more. They're also forced possibly to stay in homes that they don't need to, maybe there's an empty nester who would like to downsize. There's really nowhere for them to go. So they're staying in a home that's too big for them. Or you see people who are buying sort of above what they wanted to pay because there is nothing in their price range. So then that's creating, some income instability for them because they're paying more than they can truly afford.
Right, they're house poor. Right?
Yeah, we also have this thing in Lancaster where because of our housing stock, the age of our housing stock, we have a lot of units that are multi-bedrooms and things like that, especially in Lancaster City. And we have almost 50% of our households are single or one person. So you have people that are living in,
a 4-bedroom house.
Right. That don't need all of those bedrooms.
Right.
But they, again, are having trouble finding a place to downsize to. So we have this mismatch, and we're also seeing household sizes decreasing. So we're seeing, sort of the average household, which was once probably 2 adults, 2 kids, that's slowly decreasing. But we're building the same housing stock. We're building 4-bedroom homes.
Yeah. I've also noticed, and I want to double back to that in a minute. I've also noticed that kids that I had in youth group, right? So the generation that's now between, I don't want to do this math, but now between 20 and 30, this isn't news to anyone. There is no urgency to get married, start a family. That's just something people are putting off into later in life. So that is, in some ways, it's not that they are exacerbating the problem, but those individuals have good jobs. They're they're making good money, but they're living in a 3-bedroom, a 2-bedroom unit or something, largely by themselves. And what you're saying is doing that in Atlanta, Philadelphia, whatever, more likely to have a single person thing. But here in Lancaster, it's kind of you're more likely to have a 2 or 3-bedroom house or a 4-bedroom house that you're living in by yourself.
Yeah, not as much for young professionals. They're definitely seeking newer inventory, and they can afford some of the newer inventory that's coming onto the market. But I would say for folks that are maybe wanting to downsize,
that's hard.
It's hard for them to find an affordable rental.
Okay.
And with interest rates, that just exacerbates the problem because, if you're locked into something an interest rate that you got,
in
prior
2020,
to, at the housing crisis, you're losing money even if you downsize and go to a smaller unit. Your mortgage is still going to be more. So there's just a number of factors at play that are making it really difficult for people. On the rental side of things, we know that about 50% of renters are housing and transportation income limited. So they're paying more than 30% of their income on housing, which there's a standard that says you should not pay more than 30% of your gross on housing.
Right.
But then when you also look at where job centers are located and where the housing is, there's a lot of people that are having to travel pretty far, to get to a job.
Oh, okay.
So the transportation costs also, when you have to drive, let's say you live in Wrightsville, but you're working at Urban Outfitters and Gap, because you can't find housing anywhere between,
that becomes a part of your housing cost in a sense.
Correct. Yeah. It just becomes another thing that starts to drain your income. And then when you look at inflation the past few years and the cost of, groceries and gas and all those things.
Everything.
Yes. So the most recent statistic I saw was in order to afford a sort of, market rate 2-bedroom unit, you need to be making at least $22 an hour. And, there are jobs where you can make $22 an hour, but there's a lot of jobs that are still
under that. Yeah, substantially.
Substantially under that. And so I'm not saying raising wages is necessarily the answer, but because housing costs have gone up so dramatically, and I'm not sure that they're going to come down.
Right.
Something on one side's got to give there, so people can have some dispensable income.
I think it's interesting what you just kind of said, because it reminds me of there's a line that's repeated over and over again in the book of Judges. Like, there was no king in Israel and everyone did what was right in their own eyes, right? And I'm going somewhere with this, I promise. There's a little bit of these things are created by anything. They're created by a series of steps that if you looked at that step in a vacuum, you'd go, oh, I see why that person did that, right? Mm-hmm. Like, oh, we're building housing and it's going to be Section 8 and it's going to be low income accessible. Oh, we got halfway down and our expenses ballooned and now we're going to make it, oh, we can get $2,500 per month per unit. Oh, okay, let's go in that direction, right? And then it's like housing that was hopefully, that's something we've heard from, our friends at LS, the social worker over there, like it's almost impossible to build, lower income housing in the LS school district because of that, right? Mm-hmm. Like of a growth in that. And, we think about housing prices coming down. I mean, if you're looking for a house, that's good. If you're selling a house, you probably don't want housing price. You know what I mean? If I own a house and a significant chunk of kind of what I hope to live off of is tied up in that house that was worth $200,000 being worth $350,000, that feels like a good thing to me. So, I mean, I don't know how much you feel comfortable talking about that, but like, how have you seen kind of stuff like that where it's like, it seems good, but kind of and maybe it is good, but the downstream effects end up being what you kind of don't hope for.
Yeah.
Sorry, putting you on the spot.
No, not at all. There's so many things I could say about this. And I think the thing I'll choose to talk about is, I think when you talk about the need for affordable housing, people have sort of perception of what that is. Maybe it's people who don't work at all. That's really not the case. I mean, when we're looking at building affordable housing, it's incomes that are what you or I would expect, a policeman, a firefighter, a teacher, a daycare person to be able to afford. So it is, sort of sustainable housing for folks.
The phrase, I'm sorry, that's interesting because you're teaching me something here.
Yeah.
The phrase affordable housing doesn't mean somebody who's permanently disabled. It doesn't mean somebody like, I'm not saying
but it also includes
them.
But it also includes people that are working
what we
would
call a normal income.
But just cannot afford the rents that are sort of being demanded by the construction costs and what people are able to charge, but they're able to charge that because there's a lot of people paying a lot more than 30% of their income to make those rents because they need a place to live. So what does that do to us as a community? It means people, are not able necessarily to pay for nutritious meals for their family, or maybe are making a decision between, medicine and another expense. So they're not as healthy, which then is an ROI that you see in the healthcare system, you know, so everything's connected here. And
even something as simple as, I'm not going to choose to go to a restaurant, right? Like, like you look at, like, am I going to go to a Hershey Farms on a Saturday if I'm, completely underwater on finance? And so the housing becoming more affordable, hopefully would, help other areas as well. And like you said, everything's connected in both directions.
Yeah. And I think it's just the acknowledgement that, we are all connected here. And so, the fact that, there are people who can't afford sort of those basic necessities. And a lot of times those people are sort of hidden, they sort of will go to the food bank and they'll look for ways, to cut costs. But the other thing is then they have no safety net. So like if you have a car repair you weren't expecting, or I've seen this over and over in the city, you're a renter and you didn't know your toilet was leaking, and then the landlord gets this ridiculous water bill that he passes along and you can't cover it. It's like those types of things that you then don't have any safety net to cover that can result in homelessness.
Yeah, right. Where it just hits you, or in some cases it's reasonable for landlords to just say, hey, you can't live here anymore because I want to charge more in rent. That is possible, right?
Yeah.
Like that's hard for us to imagine, but it's certainly something
if
that
they get
happens.
To us, we have fair housing advocates that can help get those extensions, because you're not allowed to kick someone out of a lease. Mid-lease.
Oh, okay.
So there is some of that we can help with, but not everyone knows about that. So
let's talk about some of that stuff. There's stuff that maybe people aren't aware of, and a friend, family member. Like you said, this is a hidden suffering, if you will. Friend, family member is experiencing challenges. Something went wrong, medical, whatever. What's available? Like what's out there? And I know that's a several paragraph long answer, but what would you say to somebody who is, hey, I'm pretty sure they're going to be homeless, or maybe I know someone who is homeless and they're not talking to anybody about it. Yeah.
What we counsel people to do is, if they are homeless currently, so living in a car, we talked about this, living in a storage unit, if they don't meet the HUD definition of homelessness, if they're like living with a family member or a friend, and staying with them, But if they meet the HUD definition, they should call 211, which is manned by staff at the United Way of Lancaster. And then they do sort of like the pre-qualification. And then at Tenfold, we have community homeless assessment specialists that will take their information, get them on waiting lists for, transitional housing programs and things like that. So that's kind of the first step. If people there's so many people that are on the like sort of verge of homelessness, one sort of emergency away. There's not safety nets for that. There really isn't. And that's where I feel like, as a community, having, programs that can help people avoid eviction from the affordable housing that they're already in, like the food programs, there are other programs that people can access through their kids' social workers at school and things like that. That's really the safety net. But I don't have a solution necessarily to someone whose car breaks down and they can't make it to work.
Right.
That's where like having a network of friends and family through your church or through, other networks in the community is so important, because there just aren't a lot of financial resources out there.
Right. Yeah. It can be hard to kind of get up from a big hit that kind of takes you out. There's that stat that's like most American households can't afford a $600 emergency or something like that. And I mean, it's, and we Steve Eckernach came in, we were talking about, financial planning, and obviously that stuff plays a role. But yeah, those emergencies, they can hit you at a time when, and if you have an emergency fund, if you spend it on an emergency and another emergency happens, you're right there again. Right. So let's talk a little bit about kind of the faith-based aspect of this. Like, what does, in your mind as a Christian, what is like my role as a Christian in a community, whether that is it becoming more aware? Is it giving to organizations? Is it volunteering? Like, what if you had a Christian friend who was saying, man, what you do is so inspirational to me. I really think it's cool. Like, what does it look like to do my part as a believer to care for the homeless?
Yeah. So for people who have said that to me lately, I've said, please come help me in the morning shift at the shelter. And so many people have, which we've gotten over 200, I think it's like 270 at this point, people who have filled out forms that said, I'll talk to my network about what your priority needs are at any given time, or I'll come in and volunteer, and the morning shift is like cleaning and turning over beds and taking out the trash and all that stuff. In the evening, it's the intake process and, literally like taking people's information, assigning them a bed, helping them get settled if they're there for the first time, kind of explaining how things work. But I think in general, what I would say is, spend some time and just read the stories, because I think there are a lot of assumptions that get made about why people are homeless. And I mean, we're serving at the low barrier shelter people in their 20s to people in their 70s. We have 2 people that have been with us that use wheelchairs. We have 3 people that are regulars that, use walkers that are loaded down with stuff. And I wonder how they move around the city, honestly.
Right.
We have people that clearly have some mental health challenges. We have people that probably have intellectual disabilities that may or may not have been diagnosed. So it's just, there are so many circumstances. And I think if you get close to the issue and you understand the stories, and especially like just taking the time to volunteer, you have a new perspective.
So where can I go to kind of hear those stories? Is there?
We're sharing them on our blog, the Tenfold blog. I would say it's more through the eyes of volunteers.
Sure.
We really try to, protect our folks that we serve. We haven't done a lot of that at Low Barrier Shelter. We have a lot of stories of people that we've served at Tenfold, including the TLC shelter. There's one that we put out recently about, because we have 17 beds set aside for veterans at TLC. And veterans have a high rate of homelessness, and in part because in some ways of some of the trauma that they may have experienced. Trauma is one of those things that shows up and can put you in a cycle of sort of like shame and not wanting to ask for help. And so veterans can be especially susceptible to that. So we have a story now of a woman who went to TLC with her daughter, ended up, getting a job, is completely stable, but we provide very intense case management wraparound services, whether that's employment training or, which is mental health resources as well. But that could be any of us, know? And so I think just challenging your own assumptions, like, oh, everybody that's homeless has a substance abuse problem. Yeah. That's not the case at all.
I mean, even the cost of medication, we changed insurances recently, and I had a medication go from $10 to $40. And when I went to CVS, they were like, oh, whatever. I was like, are you sure?
Could you check that?
Yeah, and it's, I mean, obviously that's not a backbreaking amount of money, but it was just like, it's one medication. I can only imagine if you take several that all of a sudden it's imagine going from 40 to, I don't know, whatever, 160, you know what I mean? On a per month basis. It's like, oh, okay. I can adjust some things, but the decisions to, people talk about it all the time. Am I going to get a medication that I'm told I need, or am I going to eat, or am I going, and stuff like that. And well,
I think you asked me too about sort of from a Christian perspective. And for me, when you think about housing and you think about homelessness, if you don't know where you're going to sleep tonight, you can't get to the level of reading scripture and, thinking about those things. You're just focused on surviving,
right.
What am I going to have to eat? Where am I going to sleep? Am I going to be safe?
Yeah.
Those types of things. So when I look at people, when I look at souls, that are coming to shelter, I think how can I help get them to a point where they're living the life that God meant them to live, and just seeing people, as I hope, God looks at me, and I'm a sinner, but I haven't experienced homelessness. But how can we get people the help, the resources, whatever it is to stabilize them so they can sort of experience, what I'm blessed enough to experience, and being able to come to church and, fellowship and grow as a Christian.
Yeah, I think it's the empathy piece is so hard to build. Not hard to build, but I think it's I was talking to Alyssa the other day. We've never been 50-50 on being able to feed our kids. You know what I mean? Our oldest is 9 years old, and we were kind of looking back, and we were we've gone through some emergencies, some, tight spots, whatever. But that's never really been hungry. We've never, we've not, like you said, I've never wondered where I'm going to sleep on in a night. And I think it's just being able to hold space for people who are going through that. It's if you can bring yourself to imagine, would you show up at a church if the difference of, would I show up at a church or a women's group or a men's group if I could use those 2 hours to maybe figure something out? Probably not, you know, and I think there's just a ton of value in helping people through those moments and trying to lift them up. I also, as a Christian, it's if we're talking about ways to make Jesus look good and to represent Christ in the world, it's an easy win to help people, right? It's just it's if you want to help people in a way that they're never going to forget, help them in a moment like that, and Well, I think what you guys are doing is incredibly cool. I'm excited about it. You said you need volunteers. How long will, are the shelters open permanently, or is it just a winter thing? Or, if somebody's listening to this and let's say it's December 12th, right? How could they be a part of what you guys are doing?
Yeah, I think we're actually set with volunteers. All the shifts so far have been full. So we open November 4th. The Clay Street shelter is supposed to open around Christmas time. They will open with 40 beds, and then there'll be a slow progression until they get to 80. So we'll probably stay open an extra 2 weeks beyond when they open. So depending on when this plays, we may not be open, or we may only be open for another month. But we have sort of a list of needs on the website that we change every week, just depending on what we have a lot of, what we're running out of. It's been sort of fluctuating. So that would be the best way to, I think, help with temporary shelter. And then overall, as an organization, I co-chair the Coalition for Sustainable Housing with Kate Zimmerman from United Way. So we are a group that advocates for more affordable housing to be built throughout the community. So a way to plug in there would be just to find out if there's anything planned for wherever you live, and get involved in advocating for affordable housing.
Right.
Because a lot of times we know that there's a need for it. There are developers who are interested in trying to build it, but sometimes there's pushback from the community.
Sure.
And understanding what we talked about earlier, which is affordable housing isn't just for people with zero income. It's for your teachers, your bus drivers, your police officers, your firemen, people that just aren't making enough to afford market rate yet, and wanting to have those folks be part of your community.
The Find and Follow podcast is a production of Grace Community Church. We are located at 212 Peach Bottom Road in Willow Street, Pennsylvania, and you could join us for services on Saturdays at 6 p.m., Sundays at 8 a.m., 9:15 a.m., and 11 a.m. We hope to see you there.